I was one of three co-directors of State of the World 2009. And before I say anything more about it, I want to thank our speakers for being here today and all of you for being here today, and to say good afternoon. And I want to also acknowledge that I'm part of a team. Another co-director who is here is Janet Son, who's the longtime Director of Energy and Climate. Janet, could you just stand up so people see you? Janet and I worked very, very closely, along with Michael Renner, senior researcher at the Worldwatch Institute, who's in Long Island and not able to join us today. But we were the team of co-directors who worked with our longtime editor, Linda Stark, to try to herd the cats who were our 47 authors to produce the book that you see before us. And I was very interested in the remarks of Dr. Pachauri and Dr. Liedergaard in that they illustrated something that we were struck with in preparing our work for the book, which is the gap between what the science says is needed in this issue in terms of how we mitigate and reduce emissions, and also how we adapt to this problem, and what, as Dr. Liedergaard referred to them, what the politicians are really talking about. I think that if we were imagining climate change from the perspective of historians a long way down the road, we would see the solutions in very different ways from the way the politicians see them right now. And that's kind of the theme of the discussion we're about to have. I think about things like trade, the possibility of integrating trade ultimately with good behavior in terms of climate, which is certainly not on the table at Copenhagen for understandable reasons. I think about the moral imperative of closing the gap in per capita emissions, the broad gap between the per capita emissions of countries like the United States and countries like those in sub-Saharan Africa, or countries that are reaching for development, and how important it is to close that gap, and that discussion isn't really yet happening at the level of negotiations. And then I think, because it's a personal interest of mine, about world population and what a good news story that has been the last 20 or 30 years. In fact, the strategic decisions that many countries made around that issue in terms of providing reproductive health care to women and men who wanted it, and the fact that that's cut world fertility in half and made a real difference in something that ultimately is very important to the climate. It occurred to me in hearing Dr. Pachauri talk about the difference in President-elect Obama's ideas about cutting emissions in Europe, in part reflects, and I don't say this to justify his stand, which I also disagree with, the fact that the U.S. population, this is not just a developing world issue, has grown by about 20% since 1990, whereas Europe's population, the members of the European Union, have grown by 2 or 3%. These are the kind of differences we need to deal with, and these are the sorts of things that one would hope eventually negotiators will wrestle with, although I wouldn't expect it as soon as Copenhagen. But I've asked our panelists today, who are among three of the outside Worldwatch authors that we were able to bring to this work, and I think represent the kind of talent, experience, and insight that we were able to get for the whole book, to help me and help all of us, in effect, think a little bit outside of the usual box of climate change and climate change solutions, by looking at both their own work and maybe things that have happened since their own contributions to the state of the world, that maybe aren't talked about as much or thought about as much, or there isn't as much public awareness about. And so we're going to have a kind of a conversational approach, almost a bit of a talk show here in front of you. I'm going to just ask them a few questions. I'm going to try to ask 3 questions if time allows, and after each participant responds to each question, I will entertain the possibility, let's put it that way, of either burning or clarifying questions from the audience, very briefly, maybe 1, maybe 2 questions, so that we can have a fuller audience participatory process at the end as time allows with everything they had to say. So I want to introduce our group, starting with Sara Scherr, who's to my right. Sara I've known for a number of years and admired her thinking, which is very expansive, on how agriculture, land use, the food system work together with environmental sustainability and livelihood for farmers to produce a better world for all of us. Sara is the president and CEO of Eco Agriculture Partners, and is a partner with Worldwatch in this work, and we're delighted to have her here today. Tom Lovejoy, I think to this audience needs probably very little introduction at all. Tom is currently the biodiversity chair of the Heinz Center on Science, Economics, and the Environment, has also worked for the Smithsonian and the World Bank, and has written eloquently, particularly about biodiversity and the importance of intact forests for biodiversity. And I first became a strong admirer of Tom's 20 years ago when he invited then executive editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, along with some other influential journalists, to travel with him to the Amazon to see what deforestation looks like and its impacts on the ground. And there was a notable shift in the way the Washington Post covered the environment after Ben spent time with Tom in the Amazon. I was a reporter at the time, and I wasn't invited on that trip, and I've always liked to think since then that Tom knew I was already on point on these issues. Finally, Bill Hare, whom I've known the least amount of time in this process, but I'm delighted to call him my colleague and friend now, particularly since working with him on State of the World. I first encountered Bill Hare at a meeting of the U.S. Climate Action Network last year, and he presented a series of graphs that showed the kind of decrease that emissions will need to take in order for us to land safely on the climate. And they were pretty radical, and I thought right away, this is somebody we want to be involved with in terms of State of the World, and I was gratified that he accepted our invitation to write a chapter about exactly that, how we get to a safe landing on climate change. So I want to actually begin with Bill first on this first question, which relates to his chart. I think that if I had to point to one sort of centerpiece or one page or one illustration into a warming world that illustrates what we were trying to get across, it's the chart in his chapter where he shows, and I was expecting a graph that would show emissions going up for a little while and then coming down pretty drastically and then sort of having a nice smooth glide path pretty close to zero. But Bill surprised us with one that went subterranean in 2050 and actually went to negative emissions, which was an intriguing concept. And I want to begin by asking Bill and then all the authors, what exactly are negative emissions and what's the implication of that for the work we have ahead of us? So let me start with Bill on that one.
Sure. Well, the reason why